Mark had been driving trucks for over 15 years, but tonight felt different. He had just picked up a load in a small town and was heading down an old, winding highway. It was late, well past midnight, and the world outside was dark and quiet. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. He had driven this route many times before, but tonight something seemed off. The air felt colder than usual, and there was an eerie stillness in the air. Mark shrugged it off. It was probably just his imagination, he thought. After all, he had been driving for hours, and the lack of sleep was starting to get to him. The road stretched out in front of him, a long, empty stretch of black asphalt. Mark flicked the lights on high beam, scanning the road for any signs of life. But there was nothing. No other vehicles, no houses, no animals. Just darkness. As he drove, he noticed something strange in the distance. It was a flicker of light, barely visible through the trees on the side of the road. Mark squinted, trying to make it out. It didn't look like a house or a streetlight. It was too small and flickering, like a candle. Curiosity got the better of him. He slowed down and turned onto a dirt path that led off the main road. The gravel crunched under the wheels as he drove toward the light. The further he went, the more the trees seemed to close in around him. The air grew colder, and a strange silence settled over the place. Mark stopped the truck when he got close enough to the source of the light. It was coming from a small, run-down cabin. The window was cracked, and the door was hanging off its hinges, swaying slightly in the wind. A faint, flickering light came from inside, like a candle burning low. He hesitated, unsure whether he should get out and investigate. Something about the place felt wrong, but he had never been one to shy away from mystery. He grabbed his flashlight, swung the door open, and stepped out into the night. The cold hit him immediately, biting at his skin. He walked toward the cabin, his boots crunching in the gravel. As he got closer, the air seemed to grow heavier, thick with an unsettling energy. He stopped just outside the door and peered inside, but there was nothing there but shadows and the flickering light. "Hello?" Mark called, his voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. He pushed the door open further and stepped inside. The cabin smelled musty, like it had been abandoned for years. The light was coming from an old worn candle sitting on a wooden table in the center of the room. There was no one there, just the candle flickering in the cold air. Mark took a few more steps into the room, his flashlight sweeping over the walls. Old photographs lined the shelves, dusty and faded. A large cracked mirror hung on one wall, reflecting the dim light of the candle. The place seemed frozen in time, like it hadn't been touched in decades. Then, Mark noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the reflection of the mirror, he saw a figure standing behind him. He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no one there. He took a step back, trying to calm his racing heart. It must have been a trick of the light, he told himself, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. He turned back to the mirror and saw it again. The figure, standing just behind him, staring at him with dark, empty eyes. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He knew he wasn't alone. Before he could react, the candle flickered one last time and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Mark's heart raced as the darkness swallowed him whole. His flashlight flickered once, casting eerie shadows across the room. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The air seemed to grow colder, almost freezing, and the silence around him felt suffocating. He quickly turned the flashlight back on and scanned the room. The beam of light bounced around, illuminating the old furniture, the dusty shelves, and the cracked walls. But there was nothing there. No figure, no movement. Just the haunting stillness of the cabin. Mark breathed heavily, trying to calm himself. He told himself that it was just his nerves, that he was imagining things. He had been driving for too long, and the fatigue was playing tricks on him, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He backed away from the mirror and moved toward the door. He needed to get out of there. The cabin felt wrong. like something was lurking just beyond the edges of his perception. He reached for the door handle, but before he could open it, he heard a sound, a soft, almost inaudible whisper. It came from behind him. Mark froze. The whisper was low and unintelligible, like someone was speaking in a language he didn't understand. It was a strange, unsettling sound, like the wind itself had a voice. He turned slowly, shining the flashlight into the dark corners of the cabin. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, as his flashlight passed over the far corner of the room, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A pair of glowing eyes. They were small, but they glowed with an unnatural light, like the eyes of an animal. They blinked once, and then the shape of something moved in the shadows. It was tall, almost unnaturally tall, and its limbs were too long for its body. Mark couldn't see its face, only those glowing eyes, locked onto him with a chilling intensity. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as the creature stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The floor creaked beneath its feet, and the whispering grew louder, more urgent. Mark didn't wait to see more. He ran. His boots pounded against the wooden floor as he rushed toward the door, but the door wouldn't open. It was stuck, jammed shut. Panic surged through him as he pulled at the handle, his mind racing. The creature was getting closer. He turned around, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The eyes were getting closer too, and the whispering grew louder. It was almost like it was speaking to him now, calling his name. "Mark," the voice whispered, dragging out each syllable. "Mark, stay." He stumbled back, his heart racing. The creature was almost upon him now, its long, twisted fingers reaching for him. He could hear its breath, slow and deep, as it got closer and closer. He had to get out. With a final, desperate yank, he pulled the door open and fell outside onto the dirt path. He didn't stop to look back. He scrambled to his feet and ran toward the truck, the sound of the creature's footsteps echoing in the darkness behind him. The cold air burned in his lungs as he sprinted, the fear driving him forward. He reached the truck, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the keys. His mind was racing, but all he could think about was getting away from that place. He finally found the keys, unlocked the door, and climbed into the driver's seat. He slammed the door shut and started the engine, the truck roaring to life. As he pulled away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was still there, sitting in the darkness. But there was something different now. The windows of the cabin were glowing, as if the house itself was alive. And in the window, he saw it. The figure, those glowing eyes. But this time, they were watching him. Not from the mirror, but from the cabin itself. Mark's foot pressed harder on the accelerator, and he sped down the road, not daring to look back again. The whispering voice still echoed in his mind, growing fainter with each mile. "Mark," it called. "You can't escape." Mark didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those glowing eyes, staring at him from the darkness. He saw the figure in the cabin, watching, waiting. He saw the twisted creature that had almost caught him. He drove through the night, trying to outrun the fear that gripped him. But no matter how fast he drove, no matter how far he went, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Every turn he made, every stretch of empty road, felt like the creature was just behind him, getting closer. The truck's headlights cut through the night, but they seemed to make the darkness even deeper, more suffocating. Hours passed, and Mark's fatigue grew. His eyes were heavy, and his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. He needed to stop, to rest, but every time he considered pulling over, a deep instinctual fear kept him on the road. He couldn't stop, not yet. The landscape around him began to change. The trees grew thicker, the road narrower. It was a part of the highway he didn't recognize. Even though he had driven this route countless times before, the sky was overcast, the clouds thick and dark, as if the world itself was closing in on him. And then he saw it, a sign, half hidden by the trees, barely visible in the gloom. It read, Deadman's Hollow, 2 miles. Mark's stomach tightened. He had heard the stories about Deadman's Hollow. Old-timers at truck stops whispered about it, about the disappearances, the strange happenings. No one who had ever driven through there came back the same. Some didn't come back at all. But it was too late to turn back now. He was already too far into the woods. There was no way out but forward. The road narrowed even further, the trees leaning in on both sides, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers. The air grew colder still, and the truck's engine seemed to struggle, like it was fighting against the dark. Then, out of nowhere, the truck's headlights flickered and went out. Mark slammed on the brakes, but the truck kept rolling, sliding on the slick road. His heart hammered in his chest as he tried to steer, but it was no use. The truck slid off the road, crashing into the thick trees. Everything went black. Mark woke to the sound of rain pounding against the truck's windows. His head throbbed, and his vision was blurry. It took him a few moments to remember what had happened. The truck had skidded off the road. He had crashed into the trees. The air inside the cabin felt damp and cold. Mark tried to move, but his seatbelt was still fastened, holding him in place. He unbuckled it and rubbed his head, trying to clear the fog from his mind. The truck was stuck, wedged between 2 trees. The engine was dead, the lights dim, and the windshield was cracked. Mark cursed under his breath. He had to get out of here. He opened the door, the chill of the night air rushing in. The rain was pouring down, soaking him instantly. He looked around. The dense forest stretched endlessly, the trees pressing in on him like silent watchers. Everything was too quiet, too still. The road was just a blur now, barely visible through the sheets of rain. Mark could barely make out any landmarks. He knew Deadman's Hollow was close, but something told him he wasn't in the hollow yet. He was on the edge of it, maybe. Somewhere he didn't want to be. Taking a deep breath, he decided to leave the truck behind and walk. He needed to find help, maybe a nearby house or a gas station, anything to get out of this cursed place. He grabbed his flashlight, slamming the truck door shut behind him. The rain fell in heavy sheets, but the silence remained, thick and oppressive. As he trudged through the mud, his flashlight cutting through the rain, he thought he heard something, a faint sound, like footsteps behind him. Mark froze. He listened closely, his heart pounding in his chest. There it was again, a soft crunch of footsteps in the mud. Someone or something was following him. He whipped around, but the flashlight only illuminated the empty stretch of road behind him. He tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, but the feeling of being watched gnawed at him. He turned back around and quickened his pace. The feeling grew worse with every step. Something was closing in on him. Suddenly, he saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, just out of the reach of his flashlight's beam. Mark's blood ran cold. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, still and silent, watching him. "Who's there?" Mark shouted, trying to sound confident, though his voice wavered. No response. He took a step toward the figure, and it took one step back, retreating into the forest. Mark's breath quickened. He shouldn't follow it, he knew that. But curiosity and something deeper, something darker, pushed him forward. He walked cautiously, following the figure's movements through the trees. The forest seemed to close in around him, the rain falling heavier now, drenching him completely. The figure led him deeper into the woods, until the trees were so thick that Mark could barely see in front of him. The flashlight's beam flickered and dimmed, and the temperature seemed to drop, the air growing colder and colder. Then, suddenly, the figure stopped. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He was close now, close enough to see it clearly. The figure turned slowly, revealing its face. Mark gasped, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't a person at all. The creature's face was twisted, like something not meant for this world. Its eyes were wide and black, almost entirely devoid of any whites. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over its skull, and its mouth was unnaturally wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that seemed too big for its face. The creature smiled, an awful, twisted grin that made Mark's stomach churn. "Mark," it whispered, its voice a rasping hiss. Mark's body froze. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The creature's voice, his name, it sounded so wrong, so unnatural. "You should have stayed away," it continued, stepping closer. Mark took a shaky step back, panic flooding his veins. His legs felt like lead, heavy and uncooperative. But he had to get away. He had to. A sharp guttural laugh echoed through the trees, and before Mark could react, the creature lunged at him. He didn't have time to think. Instinct took over, and he turned and ran, stumbling over the uneven ground. The creature's laughter rang in his ears, and he could hear it gaining on him, its steps heavy and quick. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed himself harder, his legs burning with effort. He didn't dare look back. He just ran. He had to find the road. He had to get back to the truck. The creature was right behind him now. Mark could hear it breathing, hear its claws scraping against the ground, hear its twisted laughter getting closer. He stumbled again, his foot catching on a root, and he fell to the ground with a heavy thud. Pain shot through his leg, but he barely noticed. He scrambled to his feet, trying to ignore the searing pain in his ankle. When he looked up, the creature was there. It stood over him, its shadow looming large in the rain-soaked forest, its eyes gleaming with malice. It reached down with one long, gnarled hand, grabbing Mark by the collar and lifting him off the ground. "You can't escape," it whispered, its cold breath washing over him. "You're mine now." Mark struggled, trying to break free, but the creature's grip was like iron, unyielding. His vision blurred, and panic surged in his chest. He was going to die here, in this dark, cursed place, alone. But then, just as Mark thought he couldn't fight anymore, there was a sudden sound. A car, the distant hum of an engine. The creature paused, its grip loosening just slightly. Mark didn't waste a second. He kicked out with all his strength, knocking the creature's hand away. It let out an angry hiss, but Mark didn't wait. He ran, limping as fast as he could toward the sound of the car. He pushed through the underbrush, his heart pounding, his body screaming in pain. The car was getting closer, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Finally, Mark burst into a small clearing and saw it. A truck just like his. Without hesitation, he ran toward it, waving his arms, shouting for help. The truck slowed, its headlights washing over him. Mark could barely see the driver, just a silhouette in the rain. The truck stopped in front of him, the door opening. Mark didn't even wait for the driver to speak. "Please, you have to help me," Mark shouted, his voice desperate. The driver, a man with a weathered face and a thick beard, stared at him for a moment. Then, without saying a word, he reached out a hand. Mark grabbed it, and the man pulled him inside. The truck door slammed shut, and the truck sped away, leaving the darkness and the creature behind. Mark slumped against the seat, his chest heaving, trying to catch his breath. The rain continued to pour outside, but inside the truck, the world felt safe. He was finally out of Deadman's Hollow, or so he thought. As the truck drove through the night, Mark looked out the window, trying to shake off the terror that still gripped him. But when he glanced at the rearview mirror, his heart froze. There, in the distance, he saw it. The creature. And it was following him. Tom had been driving trucks for almost 20 years. He knew every road, every turn, and every pit stop along his routes. But tonight, something felt different. He had just picked up a load in a small town and was heading out on a quiet stretch of highway. It was well past midnight, and the road ahead seemed endless. The headlights of his big rig cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead. The radio played softly, nothing but static in between the occasional country song. Tom yawned and rubbed his eyes. He was tired, but he had to keep going. He had a delivery to make in the morning, and there was no time to waste. The highway was long and straight, with barely any other vehicles. Tom had been on this road many times before, but tonight felt strange. It was too quiet. Even the usual sounds of the wind and the road beneath the tires seemed distant. As he drove, Tom noticed a sign on the side of the road. It was old, its edges worn and faded. It read, "Old Mill Road, 10 miles." Tom frowned. He didn't remember this road being on his route. It wasn't on his map and he had never seen it before, but there was no other way to go. The road ahead was blocked off by construction. It would take him hours to turn around and find another way. He decided to keep going, convinced it was just a shortcut. The further he drove, the more the road seemed to change. The trees on either side of him grew thicker, their branches twisting into strange shapes. The darkness around him deepened, and the air felt colder. He shivered, though he wasn't sure why. Then, ahead, he saw something that made him slow down. A faint light flickered in the distance, just off the side of the road. It looked like a lantern, or a small light in a house window. But there was nothing else around for miles. Tom thought it was strange, but didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just a farmhouse or a small building. As he got closer, the light flickered again and went out. Tom hesitated. Something didn't feel right, but he couldn't explain it. The road was empty, and the silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. He decided to drive on, but as he passed the spot where the light had been, he saw something else. A figure, standing by the side of the road. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat. His face was hidden in shadow, and he didn't move as Tom's truck passed by. Tom could barely see his face, but he could feel the man's eyes on him. The figure was still like a statue, but there was something unnerving about him. Tom's heart raced. He didn't know why, but he suddenly had the feeling he was being watched. The road ahead seemed even darker now. Tom glanced back at the figure, but when he turned his eyes to the rearview mirror, the man was gone. Shaking his head, Tom pushed down on the gas pedal, trying to shake the strange feeling. He just needed to get to the next town, where he could take a break. Minutes passed, but the darkness around him felt more oppressive. The trees were closer now, their branches hanging low over the road. The air was colder still, and the faint feeling of being watched never left him. Then, just as he was about to take a turn, his headlights flickered. "Not now," Tom muttered under his breath, hitting the dashboard. He tried to flick the lights back on, but nothing happened. The truck's engine began to sputter, and before he knew it, the entire rig shut off. Tom groaned. He was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell signal and no way to call for help. The truck was dead. He tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't budge. The silence outside was thick, and the cold began to seep into the cab. For a moment, Tom just sat there, his heart beating loudly in his chest. He thought about getting out of the truck to see what was wrong, but something stopped him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching him. Then, there was a noise, a soft, scraping sound from outside. Tom's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. He couldn't move. He had to know what it was. Slowly, he reached for the door handle, trying to stay as quiet as possible. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, but he knew he had no choice. He opened the door slowly, the cold air rushing in. The noise had stopped, but now there was something else, a distant, muffled voice. It sounded like someone was calling out his name. Tom. His heart stopped. He felt his blood run cold. Tom, come out here. Tom's hands shook as he stepped out of the truck. The night was silent again, but the voice lingered in his ears. He glanced around, his flashlight in hand, but saw nothing in the pitch-black woods. "Tom." The voice came again, but this time it was much closer. Tom's breath hitched. He spun around, but there was no one there. The road was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind. He felt like he was losing his mind. Suddenly, the ground beneath him creaked. Tom's eyes widened. He looked down and saw the road crack open, as though the earth itself was splitting apart. The dark woods seemed to swallow up the road ahead, and the trees started to twist, their branches moving as if alive. A figure stepped from the shadows. It was the man from before, the one he had seen standing by the side of the road. But now, his face was visible. The man's face was pale, sickly looking, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into Tom's soul. His mouth twisted into a grin that sent a chill down Tom's spine. "Did you think you could just pass through here?" the man whispered, his voice cold and raspy. Tom backed away, but his legs felt weak. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body wouldn't move. "You should have stayed on the main road," the man continued, taking a step forward. Tom's heart pounded. He tried to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The man's grin widened. "Now you're part of the road just like the others, just like me." Suddenly, the ground beneath Tom's feet gave way. The road split open, and he was falling into darkness, into the depths of the earth. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed up by the void. When Tom woke up, he was lying on cold, wet ground. The air smelled musty, like an old, abandoned place. He stood up slowly, rubbing his head. His body felt heavy, as though something was weighing him down. It was dark, too dark to see anything clearly, but as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw something that made his stomach churn. There were people around him, or what used to be people. They were hunched over, their faces pale and twisted, their eyes hollow. They were standing in the dark, unmoving. Tom took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. Where was he? What was this place? A voice came from behind him. "You're one of us now." Tom spun around. The man from the road stood there, his twisted grin still in place. "You fell into the curse," the man said, his voice calm but cold. "This place, Old Mill Road, is no ordinary road. It's a place where the lost go, where those who wander too far become part of the earth." Tom shook his head, backing away. "No, I don't belong here." The man's grin grew wider. "You do now. The road claims you once you step off it. You'll never escape." Tom turned to run, but the ground beneath him shook and the figures around him moved. They closed in on him, their hollow eyes locked onto him. Tom felt his heart race in panic. No matter how fast he ran, the road was always there, stretching out in front of him. Tom ran, but every step he took felt like it was pulling him deeper into the earth. His legs felt heavy, like he was wading through thick mud. The figures around him shuffled closer, their hollow eyes fixed on him with cold, lifeless stare. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his mouth. His throat felt tight, as if something was choking him from the inside. He looked around, desperate for an escape, but the ground seemed to shift, trapping him in a maze of darkness. The man's voice echoed in his mind, a cold whisper that sent chills down his spine. "You belong to the road now, Tom. There's no going back." Tom stumbled, falling to the ground as his body collapsed from exhaustion. He was terrified, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He could feel the cold creeping into his bones, the fear tightening in his chest. "What do you want from me?" he managed to choke out, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking aloud or if it was just his mind. The figure who had called him stepped forward again, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "You're here because you sought the shortcut, the easy way. But there's no shortcut out of this place. It's a prison for those who wander too far." Tom struggled to his feet. His legs shook, but he forced himself to keep moving. He couldn't let himself fall into despair. He had to find a way out of this nightmare. He turned to the group of twisted figures that surrounded him. They moved slowly, like they were drawn to him, their eyes hungry and cold. One of them, a woman with pale, withered skin, reached out toward him with a trembling hand. "Stay away from me!" Tom shouted, but his voice was weak, barely audible. She stopped in her tracks, her hollow eyes fixed on his face. "It's too late," she whispered. "We were all once like you, truckers, wanderers, lost souls. Now we are part of the road. You will be too." Tom's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him like a wave. The figures weren't just lost travelers. They were trapped in this cursed place. and if he didn't find a way out soon, he would be like them, lost forever. The ground trembled again. Tom looked around in panic, his mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be. Suddenly, he remembered the truck. He had left it behind when the lights had gone out. The cursed figure had spoken about the road, but maybe the truck was the key. Maybe the rig itself was the only way to escape this cursed place. Without thinking, Tom sprinted in the direction where he thought the road had been. The twisted figures moved slowly behind him, but he didn't dare look back. The only thing on his mind was reaching the truck. His heart pounded in his chest as he ran through the dark, thick forest. The trees were like shadows, blocking out the moonlight, making it hard to see, but he kept going, knowing that if he stopped, it would be over. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tom spotted the headlights in the distance. His truck, his rig, was parked there by the side of the road, just as he had left it, but it looked different now. The lights flickered, and the air around it was thick with an unnatural stillness. He ran toward it, but as he got closer, something strange happened. The road in front of him started to bend, twisting in impossible ways, like it was alive. The ground cracked open beneath his feet, and the trees began to bend toward him, their branches reaching out like long, twisted fingers. He heard the voice again, that cold, rasping whisper. "Tom, you can't escape. You belong to the road now." Tom's blood ran cold. He turned back to the truck, but it was no longer just a truck. The headlights glowed eerily, and the grill of the truck twisted, forming into a grotesque face. The tires began to rotate, but instead of rolling on the road, they were sinking into the ground like the truck was part of the cursed earth. "No!" Tom screamed, but it was no use. The truck wasn't his anymore. The ground beneath him cracked open wider, pulling him closer, and the road stretched before him, leading into the dark abyss. There was no way out. Tom tried to run, but his legs were too heavy. He could feel the ground pulling him in, dragging him down into the depths. The figures, the twisted souls, were closing in on him, their hands reaching out for him. "You can't run from the road, Tom," one of them said, its voice hollow and lifeless. Tom tried to fight back, but his body felt numb, like it wasn't his own. He was being consumed by the earth, by the road, just like the others. He could feel it happening, feel the curse sinking into his skin. The last thing he saw before he was swallowed by the darkness was the twisted face of the truck, its headlights glowing like two angry eyes. Then, everything went black. Tom awoke again, but this time, it wasn't the cold, dark forest. It was bright, almost too bright. His body felt strange, heavy, but different. He looked around and saw the familiar sight of his truck, parked on the side of the road. But something was off. The truck seemed different. The lights didn't flicker like before. There was no sense of dread in the air. In fact, the world around him seemed calm, too calm. Tom shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. His legs still felt heavy, but he forced himself to stand. He looked around, taking in the stillness of the night. The road stretched out before him, quiet and empty. He reached for the door of the truck, but then froze. There, standing by the side of the road, was the same figure he had seen before, the man with the pale face and hollow eye. He was standing still, watching Tom. "Tom," the man whispered again, "you've joined us now. You are one of us." Tom's blood ran cold as the realization hit him again. He wasn't free. He had been pulled into the same curse. He was part of the road, part of the darkness. The truck, the road, the man, everything was connected, and now he was part of it. Tom wanted to scream, wanted to run, but he knew it was too late. There was no escaping this place. He looked down at his hands. They were pale, cold, and stiff. And then he understood. He had become one of them, a lost soul, trapped in the curse of Old Mill Road. And as he looked down the road, he saw other figures in the distance, waiting for him to join them. The truck's headlights flickered again, and the dark road stretched endlessly before him, calling him forward. There was no way out, only the Jake had been a truck driver for over a decade, hauling goods across the country. It was a job that paid well, but it also meant long hours and plenty of time alone on the road. Most nights, Jake enjoyed the quiet, the open road stretching ahead of him, just him and his truck. But tonight was different. It had been a long day. Jake had picked up a load in a small town in the middle of nowhere and was heading for a big city miles away. He was tired, but he knew he had to keep going. The road was empty, and the dark sky stretched endlessly above him. He turned on the radio, trying to stay awake. The clock on the dashboard showed it was already past midnight. He had another 3 hours to go before his next rest stop, but something felt off. The road was eerily quiet. No other trucks, no cars, just him. It was as if the whole world had disappeared. Jake shook his head, trying to push away the feeling. He had driven at night countless times before, and this was no different. But the silence was starting to get to him. There was no sound except for the hum of the engine and the occasional click of the turn signal. As he rounded a curve in the road, something caught his eye. Up ahead, there was a flickering light in the distance. At first, Jake thought it was just a broken streetlight, but as he got closer, he realized it wasn't. It was coming from a sign, an old wooden sign that looked like it had been there for decades. It read, "Welcome to Black Hollow." Jake frowned. He had never heard of Black Hollow before. He had driven this route many times, and there had never been a town by that name. He glanced at the clock again. He had been on this stretch of highway for hours, but he couldn't remember seeing this sign. Was he on the wrong road? The truck's headlights flickered for a moment, casting strange shadows across the road. Jake reached down to adjust the controls, but before he could, the lights went out completely. "Great," Jake muttered, slamming the steering wheel. The truck was still moving, but he could barely see the road ahead. He pulled over to the side of the highway, hoping it was just a fuse. He fumbled around in the dark, opening the glove compartment and pulling out the flashlight he kept there. He climbed out of the truck, the cold air hitting his face. The road was empty, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. Jake moved to the front of the truck and popped the hood. He shone the flashlight over the engine, looking for any signs of damage, but everything looked fine. He sighed in frustration. There was no reason for the lights to go out, and now he was stuck on some road he didn't recognize. Just as he was about to close the hood, he heard something, a faint sound coming from the woods on the other side of the road. It was a whisper, almost like someone calling his name. "Jake." He froze. The voice was low, almost a breath. It was clear, and it sounded so close, like someone was standing right behind him. He spun around, shining the flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing there, just the dark, empty woods. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaky. He knew it was probably just his mind playing tricks, but the voice sounded so real. There was no answer, only the soft rustle of the wind. Jake felt his heart start to race. He needed to get back in the truck, get on the road again. This place was starting to creep him out. He climbed back into the cab and started the engine, but before he could pull away, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror. A figure. A person was standing by the side of the road, just outside the beam of his headlights. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes. He was standing perfectly still, staring at Jake through the mirror. Jake's stomach tightened. Who was that? There was no way he had seen him before. He had just checked the road, and no one was there. His hands gripped the steering wheel, but he couldn't move. The man in the mirror didn't move. He just stared, his face pale and emotionless. Jake quickly turned the headlights on high beam and spun around in his seat, ready to confront whoever it was. But when he looked, there was no one there. His heart pounded in his chest as he quickly looked around, scanning the road and the trees. But the man was gone. There was no sign of anyone, nothing but the dark, empty highway. Jake blinked, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe it was just a shadow, something that had played tricks on him. But when he looked back at the rearview mirror, the figure was there again. This time, the man was closer, standing right behind the truck, his face only inches from the glass. Jake gasped and slammed his foot on the gas pedal, throwing the truck into gear. The truck roared to life, and he sped down the road, not looking back. The truck bounced and swerved as Jake drove faster, the headlights illuminating the empty road ahead. But the man was still there, right behind him. No matter how fast Jake drove, no matter how many turns he took, the figure was always there, in the mirror, closer each time. Jake's heart raced as he gripped the steering wheel with both hands. He had to get away, but the figure wouldn't leave him alone. It was like it was following him, no matter how fast he went. The road stretched out ahead of him, endless and dark. Jake felt like he was trapped in some sort of nightmare, with the figure always just behind him, getting closer with each passing second. Then, something strange happened. The truck's radio crackled to life, blasting static through the speakers. Jake jumped in his seat, startled. He reached for the volume dial, but it didn't help. The static was so loud it hurt his ears. And then, through the static, came a voice. "Jake, why are you running?" It was the same voice that had whispered his name earlier, but now it was louder, more urgent. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, from inside the truck, from outside, from the radio itself. Jake's blood ran cold. He had to stop. He had to pull over, figure out what was going on. He couldn't keep running. He slammed his foot on the brake, and the truck skidded to a stop on the side of the road. The headlights illuminated the trees in front of him, but the figure was gone. For a moment, Jake just sat there, breathing heavily, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. His mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening. He didn't know if he was losing his mind, or if something truly supernatural was going on. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it, a shadow moving through the trees. The same tall, thin figure, walking slowly toward the truck. Jake's pulse quickened. He couldn't stay here. He had to go, now. He slammed the truck into gear and sped off, the engine roaring as he tore down the highway. This time, he didn't look back. The road stretched out ahead of him, and he kept driving, not knowing where it would take him. The figure was gone now, but the fear still clung to him. He could feel his mind racing, his thoughts spinning. What was happening to him? As the night dragged on, Jake passed a small sign by the side of the road. It was hard to see in the dark, but the words were clear: "Welcome to Black Hollow." Jake's heart dropped. He had passed this sign earlier, hadn't he? He had already been through Black Hollow, but he'd never seen the town. The road was empty, the houses gone, the lights off. It was like the town didn't exist. Jake looked back at the sign, and in the reflection of his side mirror, he saw the figure again. This time, it was standing in front of the truck, blocking the road. The figure stepped forward, and Jake screamed. Jake slammed his foot down on the gas, trying to outrun the figure that was now directly in front of his truck. The engine roared in response, but the figure remained eerily still. It didn't move, didn't flinch as the truck hurtled toward it. With a sharp, desperate turn of the wheel, Jake swerved to the side of the road, tires skidding on the wet asphalt. The truck jolted, but he managed to regain control, his heart thudding in his chest. He quickly glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was gone. Jake didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. He was alone again. But how had it disappeared so quickly? He kept his foot heavy on the accelerator, his eyes darting between the dark road and the mirror, his hands gripped tightly on the wheel. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was chasing him, something he couldn't see but knew was there. He drove for what felt like hours, the landscape around him a blur of trees and empty fields. The road seemed endless, the miles stretching out like a never-ending nightmare. The truck's headlights illuminated the way, but beyond that, there was nothing but darkness. The radio, still blaring static, suddenly cut off with a loud crack. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Jake tried to turn it back on, but it wouldn't work. He glanced at the clock, 2:15 a.m. It felt like time had stopped, or perhaps it was moving too fast. He wasn't sure anymore. He only knew he had to get out of this cursed stretch of road. Just as he was about to pull over and check the radio, He noticed something in the distance, a flicker of light. It wasn't another truck or vehicle. No, this was different. It was a series of lights, like old street lamps. They appeared suddenly, glowing faintly through the trees. Jake's stomach twisted. He hadn't seen any signs of a town or a gas station for miles. He had to check it out. Maybe there was someone there who could help him, or at least tell him where he was. He turned the truck down a narrow gravel path, following the flickering lights. The road became rougher, the tires kicking up rocks and dirt as the truck bounced over the uneven surface. The farther he drove, the more the lights seemed to fade, like they were disappearing into the forest itself. Then, he saw it. A small, decaying building stood in front of him, surrounded by rusted street lamps. It looked like an old gas station, abandoned for years. The roof was sagging, the windows cracked, but the lights were still on, faintly glowing. Jake parked the truck and turned off the engine. His breath fogged the air as he stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. The air was thick with dampness, the smell of old wood and rotting leaves in the air. The faint glow from the lights cast strange shadows over the building, making it look even more eerie. He hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity got the best of him. He walked toward the entrance, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the stillness. As he approached the door, he noticed the glass was cracked. A chill ran down his spine, but he reached for the handle and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the inside of the gas station. It was dark, but the flickering lights from outside provided just enough illumination to make out the shelves. Most of the goods were covered in dust, and the shelves were mostly empty, save for a few cans and old, faded signs. The counter at the back of the room was cluttered with papers and forgotten objects. Suddenly, Jake felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There was someone behind the counter, a figure. He couldn't see it clearly at first, but it was there. A shadow, unmoving, watching him. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice trembling. "Is anyone here?" The figure didn't respond. He took a few steps closer, but then the figure moved. Slowly, like it was stiff, the way someone would move after standing still for a long time. It turned toward him. The person behind the counter was wearing a faded, torn uniform, and their face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. But what really caught Jake's attention were the eyes, wide, unblinking, and unsettling. They were too large, too white, like they didn't belong in a human face. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at Jake. Without thinking, Jake turned and bolted out of the gas station, his breath coming in sharp gasps. His heart was hammering in his chest, and he didn't look back. He ran to the truck, jumped into the cab, and slammed the door shut. He started the engine with shaking hands and threw the truck into gear, speeding away from the gas station as quickly as he could. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but as he drove, something strange happened. The road kept twisting and turning, as though he wasn't making any progress at all. He passed the same trees, the same patches of dirt. The lights from the gas station were now nowhere to be seen. Jake's mind raced. How could he be back here? He had just left that place. He had driven away. But everything looked the same. It was like he was stuck in some kind of loop. He slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding as it came to a stop. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. But before he could react, a voice echoed through the cab. "Jake," it whispered, "you shouldn't have come here." The voice was familiar. It was the same one he had heard earlier, deep and rasping. It came from the very air around him. Jake looked around, panic rising in his chest. He opened the truck door, his heart pounding. He stepped outside, trying to get his bearings. But as he looked into the woods, he saw someone, standing just beyond the trees. It was the same figure, the tall, thin man. His face was obscured by shadows, but Jake could feel its gaze on him. The man didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stared. Jake's pulse quickened. He had to get out of there. He couldn't stay on this road any longer. But when he looked around, the road was gone. The trees, the path, everything seemed to fade away into nothingness. He was trapped. Then a voice came from behind him, right in his ear. "You're ours now, Jake." Jake froze. The voice was chilling, like ice creeping up his spine. He spun around quickly, but there was no one there. The trees, thick with shadows, stood silently in the night. The road was gone, replaced by a dense forest that stretched on forever. The truck was nowhere in sight. He turned back toward the figure standing just beyond the trees. It hadn't moved an inch, but now Jake could feel its presence, like a heavy weight pressing on him from every direction. The figure's eyes were locked onto him, the unnatural whiteness of them glowing faintly in the darkness. "Who are you?" Jake called out, his voice shaking. He knew the question was pointless, but he needed to say something. His throat felt dry, as though the air itself was choking him. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. "You don't belong here," it said, the words heavy with something ancient and cold. Jake's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to run, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. Every instinct screamed at him to escape, to get away from this place, but the woods seemed to have swallowed up any chance of an easy retreat. It was like the world had bent, trapping him in some twisted nightmare where there was no way out. He took a step back, his foot crunching on the dry leaves beneath him. The figure didn't react, but Jake could feel its eyes following every movement. I don't understand," Jake muttered, trying to steady his breath. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, an eerie sound like a creaking door echoing through the still air. "You've already come this far, Jake," it said. "Now you must stay." The air around him grew colder, and Jake's breath came out in visible puffs. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. He had to wake up. He had to get out of here. But no matter how hard he tried to move, the forest seemed to stretch out farther. The path that should have led him back to the truck was gone. It had vanished into the trees, leaving only the shadowy figure in the endless dark ahead. Another voice, deeper, more guttural, echoed through the trees. "He's not the first, and he won't be the last." Jake's blood ran cold. He turned toward the voice, but all he saw was darkness. It was like the woods themselves were speaking. Suddenly, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. The trees loomed closer, their branches twisting unnaturally as if they were closing in around him. The air grew thick, and the wind began to howl, carrying with it a low, haunting chant. Jake stumbled backward, his legs failing him. He hit the ground hard, his head spinning. The figure, still watching from the shadows, took another step closer. "Why? Why is this happening?" Jake gasped, his voice trembling with fear. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped into the dim light cast by the faint glow of the forest. As it moved closer, Jake saw something he hadn't noticed before. The figure wasn't just a man. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, its face twisted in a grimace. There were scars, deep gashes that seemed to have been made by something far too sharp, far too real. The eyes, though, those eyes, were still the same, glowing unnaturally white, piercing through the darkness. They were filled with something cold, something that could only be described as hunger. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't stay here. He had to fight. He had to survive. Without thinking, he scrambled to his feet and bolted into the woods, blindly running through the dark. The branches clawed at his arms. The underbrush tugged at his feet, but he kept running. His breath was ragged, his chest tight with fear. He didn't know how far he ran, but it felt like hours. The forest stretched on endlessly, an unyielding maze of darkness and twisted trees. The sound of his own footsteps was drowned out by the wind, which seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the wind stopped. Jake slowed to a stop, his body trembling with exhaustion. The silence was suffocating, more intense than the howling wind had been. It was as if the forest had held its breath, waiting for something, waiting for him. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his heart pounding. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the road, the truck. anything that could lead him out of this nightmare. And then, through the darkness, he saw something, a faint light flickering in the distance. It was dim, but it was there. Jake didn't hesitate. He took off again, his legs burning with the effort. As he approached the light, it grew brighter. It was coming from the old gas station, the one he had seen earlier. He recognized the flickering street lamps, the decaying building. He burst into the parking lot, his chest heaving with each breath. The gas station loomed in front of him, and the door stood open, as though waiting for him. Jake didn't know why he went inside. Maybe it was the only thing that felt familiar. Maybe it was the only place that seemed like it might offer some sort of escape. The moment he stepped through the door, everything felt wrong. The air inside was thick with dust, and the faint smell of rot filled his nostrils. The shelves were still empty, the cans and goods covered in layers of dirt. But the room was no longer empty. The same figure from before was standing at the counter, its eyes locked onto him. This time, it wasn't alone. There were others. Figures, shadows, lurking in the corners, their features obscured by but Jake could feel their eyes, watching him. "Why are you doing this?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling with fear. One of the shadows stepped forward, its form shifting in the dim light. It didn't speak, but its presence was suffocating, like a weight pressing down on Jake's chest. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. It was as if the air had thickened, holding him in place. He struggled, but the shadows closed in on him, their eyes burning with an unnatural light. "You're ours now, Jake," the figure behind the counter said, its voice a cold whisper. "You crossed into our world, and once you do that, there's no leaving." Jake's eyes widened in realization. He had never truly left the highway. He hadn't left the cursed place. And now, he would never leave. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs as he struggled to breathe. The room felt suffocating, the air thick and heavy, pressing down on him from all sides. The shadows in the gas station closed in, their presence like cold fingers wrapping around his mind. The figure at the counter, still with its glowing white eyes, stepped forward, its lips curling into a twisted grin. "You can't escape," it said, its voice a low rasp. "Once you enter Black Hollow, you are part of it, part of us, forever." Jake's thoughts were scattered. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had never heard of Black Hollow. He had been driving down a lonely stretch of highway when something had drawn him in, led him to this nightmare. But now, in the presence of these eerie, otherworldly beings, he understood. This wasn't a place he was meant to find. You're not real," Jake choked out, though deep down he knew the truth. The shadows, the figure, this was no hallucination. The whispers, the feeling of being watched, it was all too real. "This isn't real," he repeated, trying to convince himself, but his words were hollow. One of the shadows in the corner stepped closer. It was tall, its body twisting unnaturally as if it were made from the darkness itself. Its face remained hidden, but Jake could feel its gaze. Cold, empty, hungry. "You crossed into the road that leads here," the shadow said, its voice like a wind blowing through dry leaves. "And now you belong to Black Hollow. There's no way back." Jake's knees buckled beneath him. His body, exhausted from the running and the fear, couldn't hold him up any longer. He collapsed to the floor with a grunt, his hands pressed against the ground. The shadows swirled around him like smoke, their movement fluid and unnatural. "Please," Jake whispered, his voice weak. "I don't want to be here. I just want to go home." The figure behind the counter chuckled darkly. "Home? You don't understand, do you? There is no home for you anymore. You're lost in Black Hollow now, and so are we. All of us." Jake raised his head, his eyes locking onto the figure. It was like looking at a reflection of himself, only twisted and wrong. The pale, featureless face of the figure seemed to grow larger, consuming his vision. "How long have you been here?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He had to know. The figure's eyes, impossibly wide and filled with that chilling white light, stared down at him. longer than you can imagine. Time doesn't work the same here. Once you enter Black Hollow, it bends. It stretches. You can lose yourself, not even realize how long you've been here. Days, months, years, it all feels like one long, endless night. Jake's blood ran cold. The figure was right. He had no way of knowing how long he'd been trapped on this highway, or how long he would be stuck in this nightmare. Was it days, weeks, or had he already been here for years? The shadow in the corner laughed, a hollow sound that made Jake's skin crawl. "You'll never leave, Jake. There's no escaping. There's no way out of Black Hollow. Not for you, not for anyone." Jake's breath became shallow, his thoughts a tangled mess. He needed to think, to escape, but the darkness around him was thickening, swallowing up the light from the flickering street lamps outside. The air was so heavy now, so thick with the presence of these twisted beings, that he could hardly move. He was trapped. Suddenly, the figure in front of him moved closer. Jake could feel its cold breath on his face, its presence overwhelming, suffocating him. "You're just like the others," the figure whispered. "You'll join us soon. We'll feed on your fear until you become one of us, an eternal part of Black Hollow." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "I'm not like you. I'm not like any of you." But the figure only smiled, a grin that spread wider, impossibly wide, until it was stretched across its entire face. "You don't have a choice anymore." The shadows swirled around him again, their forms twisting and shifting as if they were alive. Jake's mind screamed, but his body wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed with fear, trapped in a place that was both nowhere and everywhere. The shadows' whispers grew louder, filling his head, each voice a twisted, mocking echo of his own thoughts. Then, in the distance, something changed. Through the haze of darkness, a faint light appeared. It wasn't like the soft glow of the gas station's flickering lamps. It was bright, steady, almost like daylight. The light shone through the trees, cutting through the oppressive blackness. Jake, desperate, pushed himself to his feet. He didn't know what it was, but it was his only chance. Without thinking, he ran toward the light, his legs moving faster than they ever had before. He could feel the shadows closing in behind him, their whispers growing louder, urging him to turn back, to give in, but Jake ignored them. He had to keep going. He had to escape. The light grew brighter as he ran, until it was blinding. It felt like his eyes were burning, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. And then, suddenly, he was through. The light enveloped him, and for a moment, everything was pure brightness, overwhelming and intense. His body felt weightless, as if he was floating. There was no sound, no whispers, just the brilliance of the light. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the light faded. Jake blinked, disoriented. The road was different now. The trees were gone, replaced by a wide-open space. He was standing on the side of a highway again, the familiar rumble of trucks passing in the distance. The world was still dark, but the night felt different, normal somehow. Jake stumbled forward, his body shaking, his breath ragged. He looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was the same highway he had been on earlier, wasn't it? The road, the familiar sound of trucks, the distant lights. Everything seemed normal. But as he walked, he noticed something. The road was completely empty. No other cars, no trucks, just him. He turned around, and there it was, the sign. "Welcome to Black Hollow." Jake's stomach dropped. He had made it out. He had escaped, but somehow he was still here, and he wasn't alone. The shadows were waiting for him,